Reflections, The Tragedy of Addiction, excerpts from Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, a Breviary of Sin, by Cornelius Plantinga, Jr. Master, I am in great distress. The spirits that I conjured up I cannot now get rid of. Goethe, the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Nowhere is a broader survey more helpful and more needed than it is in the case of sin and addiction. For here, the borders are long, disputed, and sometimes indiscernible. Principally, to look at addiction is to look at significant dynamics of sin. Moreover, to discuss addiction is dramatically to raise, once more, the hard questions of human freedom and responsibility in the assessment of human behavior. What we want to explore, most generally, is the relationship between sin and addiction. Addiction is a complex, progressive, injurious, and often disabling attachment to a substance, alcohol, heroin, barbiturates, or behavior, sex, work, gambling, in which a person compulsively seeks a change of mood. The addictor might be a good staple of life, such as food and drink, or a slimy little vice, such as voyeurism. It might be almost anything if one defines addiction loosely enough. Indeed, addiction writers in recent decades have impressively lengthened the list of possible addictors so that it now includes not only alcohol and other drugs, but also sex, and not only sex, but also love and romance. Also on the growing list are shopping, religion, exercise, video games, money, and going to the movies. One writer who follows the trends in fashionable dependencies cites a confession in Pittsburgh of a sewing or fabric addiction. Leaving aside the question of how seriously to take some of the more exotic addictions, we are safe in assuming that the genesis of addictions and the number and blend within them of contributing factors, chemical, neurological, psychological, cultural, social, spiritual, vary among addictors and from one addict to another. Furthermore, addictive dependencies range along a spectrum from mild to devastating. By themselves, such variables guarantee the complexity of the addictive phenomenon. But in addition to this, some addicts also struggle with cross-addictions and multiple addictions. Some even appear to get hooked on the cures for their addictions. In certain cases, government methadone prescriptions are roughly as helpful to heroin addicts as school suspensions are to truants. Recovering addicts often come to believe that their addictions, whether single or grouped, whether predominantly chemical or psychological, include a spiritual dimension that can only be called demonic. No matter how they start, addictions eventually center in distress and in the self-defeating choice of an agent to relive the distress. In fact, trying to cure distress with the same thing that caused it is typically the mechanism that closes the trap on an addict. A trap that, as just suggested, might be baited with anything from whiskey to wool. But what moves an addict to the bait? At every stage, addiction is driven by one of the most powerful, mysterious, and vital forces of human existence. What drives addiction is longing, a longing not just of brain, belly, or loins, but finally of the heart. Because they are human beings, addicts long for wholeness, for fulfillment, and for the final good that believers call God. Like all idolatries, addiction taps this vital spiritual force and draws off its energies to objects and processes that drain the addict instead of filling him. Accordingly, the addicts long not for God but for transcendence, not for joy but only for pleasure, and sometimes for a mere escape from pain. Some therapists believe that addicts can get high on the vapors of guilt, or, less implied, that desire, pleasure, guilt feelings, and a Nietzschean will to power sometimes run together into a high-octane blend that fuels addiction. In any case, addiction taps into longing the way a blackmailer might garnish your wages. Every time you meet a demand, it escalates. Every time you recover self-respect, the will to love, or any other vital resource, it gets sapped away by this parasite. Addiction feels not only parasitical but also wily and perverse. It feels demonically alive, as if not just something but someone were trying to lure, hook, and land him. Someone who first successfully tempts him and then accuses him of weakness for having succumbed. As the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous says, addiction is cunning, baffling, powerful, and patient. A victor over every ordinary attempt to conquer it, a demon that rushes to fill vacuums, a dismissed shadow that keeps threatening to return. Thus, an addict who repeatedly makes and then breaks contracts with himself, who finds his longings narrowing and hardening into an obsession with things he knows will devastate his work, self-respect, relationships, and bank account, and who yet seeks compulsively to satisfy those longings, who thus finds his will split between wanting to banish an addictive substance from the earth and wanting to protect his private cache of it, whose addiction, as it moves through mild and moderate stages, first enthralls him in one sense of the word, and then in the other. An addict like this often comes to believe that his struggle is not against enemies of blood and flesh, but against spiritual forces of evil. Ephesians 6, verse 12. Of course, addicts try, often desperately, to manage their problem. They reproach themselves, confess their sins to God, make and break resolutions, set ever new dates for one last fling. They struggle to deal with the depressing accompaniments of their secret lives: lies, deceptions, scapegoating, alternating rage and self-pity, isolation, fear of discovery, and the loss of real intimacy with loved ones. But all this is uphill work, in part because the spiritual forces arrayed against an addict include various temptations that society approves and displays. In general, the addict must make his way in a culture that presumes everybody's fundamental right to gratify at least 5 of his senses, and that discourages self-denial as foolish or even impious. For the self is a sacred object, yet the same culture that encourages self-indulgence also punishes the indulgent with scorn fit for a failed God. This is another demonic dimension of addiction. As Gerald May has observed, the addict's repeated failures of self-mastery devastate his self-esteem, in part because he lives in a culture that teaches him that we are our own creators. A person who has succumbed to an addiction thus imagines a derisive question coming at him from his culture. What kind of moron creates but cannot control himself? What kind of car maker cannot drive his own product? An addict stands a chance of recovery only if he is finally willing to tell himself the truth. The only way out of the addict's plight is through it. He has to face it, deal with it, confess it. With the firm and caring support of people important to him, he has to rip his way through all the tissues of denial and self-deception that have protected his supply. The addict has to take a hard step, the first of the famous 12 steps. Paradoxically, he must help himself by admitting that he is helpless. He must perform the courageous, difficult, and highly responsible act of acknowledging the hopelessness and wholesale unmanageability of his life. The addict must abandon the uncanny game of hide-and-seek in the obscenity of the soul in which it, the single human soul, evades itself, avoids itself, hides from itself. Only then is the way open for his return to a tolerably healthy life, a return that is likely to take time, vigilance, and the support of a number of other human beings, some of them professionals. Given the relevant qualifications, let us say that addictions often include sin, or, putting matters the other way around, that some sin displays the addictive syndrome. Suppose we imagine sin and addiction as significantly overlapping circles. On the ends, in the quarter moons where the circles do not overlap, we have examples of addiction that include little or no actual sin by the addict himself, and examples of sin that betray little of the addictive process. Cases of intrauterine addiction, for example, belong in the former category, as do any other chemical or process addictions innocently contracted, as when a clinically schizophrenic or depressed person slides into substance addiction while seeking relief from sickness. Perhaps some addictions in these cases qualify as physical evils rather than as moral evils. In the latter category belong sins that hang around on the listless side of human life, particularly those that include little by way of mood change or a yearning for it. A person, for instance, who wholly neglects her aged parents because she finds them boring may present symptoms of sloth and filial ingratitude, but not of addiction. Sin and addiction overlap. There are certain common dynamics wherever sin manifests the addictive syndrome. Here I list dynamics of addiction. 1. Repetition of pleasurable and therefore habit-forming behaviors plus escalating tolerance and desire. 2. Unpleasant after-effects of such behavior, including withdrawal symptoms and self-reproach. 3. Vows to moderate or quit, followed by relapses and attendant feelings of guilt, shame, and general distress. 4. Attempts to ease this distress with new rounds of the addictive behavior or with the first rounds of a companion addiction. 5. Deterioration of work and relationships with accompanying cognitive disturbances, including denial, delusions, and self-deceptions, especially about the effects of the addictions and the degree to which one is enthralled by it. 6. Gradually increasing preoccupation, then obsession, with the addictor. 7. Compulsivity in addictive behavior. evidence that one's will has become at least partly split, enfeebled, and enslaved. 8. A tendency to draw others into the web of addiction. These codependents present certain addictive patterns of their own, particular the simultaneous need to be needed by the addict and to control him. The codependent relationship is thus one in which primary and parasitic addictions join. Where in the family of sins do we find displays of this syndrome? Not surprisingly, we typically find them among such appetitive sins as avarice, gluttony, and lust, the sins that exhibit some combination of exaggerated and misplaced longing. Healthy people keep a rein on their longings. Healthy people enjoy the freedom that is born of contentment, a freedom from want, which is, in turn, owed to a sturdy and persistent discipline of desire. Healthy people deliberately note, for instance, how many material goods they can do without, and then take extra pleasure in the simple and enduring ones they possess. They make it their goal, most of the time, to eat and drink only enough to relieve hunger and thirst, not to sate themselves. They integrate their sexual desire into a committed relationship, bonded by vows and trust. These disciplines are, of course, by no means easy to acquire or to preserve, and failures in this regard drearily familiar to all of us. In these respects, the discipline of desire resembles mastery of a foreign language or of a musical instrument. But a disciplined person cuts losses and tries to contain failure. She knows the traps that lie in the shadow of failure and purposely tries to skirt them. For example, the all-or-nothing trap, in which a dieter who has just fallen off the wagon by consuming a handful of peanuts concludes that she might as well now eat the whole can. Everybody fails, but for whatever reason the candidate for addiction gives in to failure, seeks deadly comfort from the same kind of thing that caused the failure, and thus begins a war against herself that is likely to take a lot of skilled, compassionate, and expensive help to stop. Given that sin and addiction have a lot in common, it's not surprising that theologians say that a therapist can help soften such wars. At the center of his Confessions, St. Augustine ponders the bondage of the will, the violence of habit by which even the unwilling mind is dragged down and held. Scripturally, Augustine is moving among those Pauline passages, Galatians 5:17, Romans 7:22-25, that speak of the war between flesh and spirit, the inner war we lose whenever we will what is right but do what is wrong. Experientially, Augustine is talking about his long battle with lust. The fearful, inexplicable, and finally eerie dynamic of moral evil, he says, is that we enslave ourselves to it. As in all tragedy, the enemy is within as well as without. We know we are doing wrong, we want not to do it, and still we do it. The reason is that at some other level of our being, we do want to do it. Giving in to the want at that level leaves bondage we both create and resent. Each wrong choice forges a link in the chain that binds us. I was bound not by an iron imposed by anyone else, but by the iron of my own choice. The enemy had a grip on my will, and so made a chain for me to hold me a prisoner. The consequence of a distorted will is passion. By servitude to passion, habit is formed, and habit to which there is no resistance becomes necessity. By these links, connected one to another, a harsh bondage held me under restraint. Passages like this one from a father of the Christian Church might be just as likely to appear in the confessions of a contemporary alcoholic or food addict, for Augustine's chain runs right through the dynamics of addiction. These are the dynamics of appetitive sin in particular, the kind of sin likeliest to display the classic addictive syndrome, likeliest to chain its subjects to their own sin, so that they become at once its agents and victims. But all sin shares with addiction at least a few of the dynamics on the list, as well as certain other common characteristics. For example, even when they do not display the full addictive syndrome, many forms of sin include patterns of self-seeking, childish impatience with delayed gratification, and refusal to accept reasonable limits on behavior. In addition, sin, like addiction, tends to split and bind the will, to work itself into a habit of the heart, and to hide itself under layers of self-deception. Moreover, people often commit sins in order to relieve distress caused by other sins, hence the familiar spiral shape of certain patterns of sin. In these and many other ways, addiction extends a tradition familiar to all of us, including all of us who would never dream of calling ourselves addicts. In important respects, the addiction experience is the human experience, since we all have a habit, where sin is concerned. Addiction shows us how the habit works, where it goes, and why it persists. In fact, we might think of addiction as a lab demonstration of the great law of returns, the law of longing and acting, and the forming of habits that lead to renewed longing. Addiction is a dramatic portrait of some main dynamics of sin, a stage show of warped longings, split wills, encumbered liberties, and perverse attacks on one's own well-being, some of the same dramatic machinery that moves the general tragedy of sin forward. Addiction shows us once more the progressive and lethal character of moral evil, the movement of corruption that Patrick McCormick calls a conversion unto death. For addicts, this conversion begins and ends in an act of surrender, first to disordered appetite and then, in recovery, to God. The theology of addiction, as Richard Moe observes, is all about giving in, about giving oneself over. Addiction is about our hungers and thirsts, about our ultimate concern, about the clinging and longing of our hearts, and about giving ourselves over to these things. When it is in full cry, addiction is finally about idolatry. At last, the addict will do anything for his idol, including dying for it. According to Mao, there comes a point in the life of every alcoholic in which he sings his own version of Martin Luther's hymn, "Let good and kindred go, this mortal life also. I'm going to get loaded." The mix of willfulness and despair, defiance and futility, in the texture of addiction rules out simple ways of addressing it. Indeed, redemption from addiction must eventually be as multifaceted and protracted as redemption from sin and its miseries. But the first question for addicts and for all sinners is plain and urgent. In whose name is your help? Who or what is your only comfort in life and in death? To whom or to what do you ultimately belong? The addict who turns to God has made the big and right decision. That is because the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of man, and his compulsion is our liberation. But no mere decision is enough. Like all sinners, the addict also needs painfully to unlearn old habits, to dismantle old scenarios, to pay old debts, and then to move steadfastly along the road to recovery one small, secure step at a time, always aware that the self we want to recover is never wholly at our disposal. Evil, says Diogenes Allen, is one of the ways we learn that we ourselves are a mystery, for we are not in full control of ourselves and cannot find any method of gaining control. The addict therefore needs not just the God who forgives, but also the God who heals, not just the good partner, but also the great physician. Like all sinners, the addict needs spiritual hygiene. For just as sin, addiction, and misery typically go together, so do confession, healing, and the long process of redemption. We need redemption not just from our sins and addiction, but also from their miseries, particularly those miseries that occasion more sin and deeper addiction. As all recovering sinners know, this process of healing and liberation, this converion unto life, this set of lessons to teach us how to dance again, will prove to be as cunning, baffling, powerful, and patient as addiction itself.